Imagine the sound of water as it meets the shore, not the crashing of a violent sea, but the rhythmic, heavy pulse of Lake Superior against the ancient basalt of Isle Royale. This is a cold, deep water, a vast inland sea that holds its secrets in a grip of ice and shadow. If you were to stand on these jagged northern shores today, the air would smell of damp cedar and the sharp metallic tang of wet stone. It is a lonely place, where the wind whispers through the white pines and the world feels as though it has remained unchanged since the retreat of the great glaciers. But beneath the moss and the tangled roots of the boreal forest lies a mystery that defies the quiet stillness of the wilderness, a series of scars upon the earth that tell a story of immense forgotten industry. When the first modern surveyors and prospectors arrived in the 19th century, they expected to find a virgin landscape untouched by the hands of man. Instead, they discovered thousands of ancient pits, deep excavations carved into the very bones of the earth. These were not the work of nature, nor the simple scrapings of a nomadic people. They were the remains of a massive systematic mining operation that spanned thousands of years, a project so vast that its scale continues to baffle those who study the silent depths of time. As you settle into your blankets and let the weight of the day drift away, consider the sheer impossibility of what was found here. In the remote reaches of the Keweenaw Peninsula and the isolated shores of Isle Royale, early explorers stumbled upon hundreds of thousands of stone hammers, simple rounded cobbles used to batter the rock and release the world's purest copper. These hammers were found in such abundance that they were often used to pave the paths of the new mining camps. And yet, the people who swung them, the ones who laboured in the biting cold of the north woods, have left us almost no other trace of their presence. They arrived, they worked on a scale that seems almost industrial, and then they vanished back into the mists of the deep past. Before we descend further into these ancient pits and explore the shadows of this lost civilization, I want to take a moment to welcome you. If you are settling in for the night and finding comfort in these stories of the old world, you are in the right place. Here at the Slumber Archives, we bring you new history narrations every single day, crafted to help you drift into a peaceful sleep. If you enjoy our journey through the mysteries of time, perhaps consider subscribing so you can join us every evening. A simple like on this video also helps others find their way to our quiet corner of the internet. But for now, let the world outside fade away, and let us return to the cold, copper-rich shores of the Great Lakes. The scale of the missing metal is perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story. Archaeologists and engineers, through careful study of the volume of the ancient pits, have estimated that a staggering 500,000 tons of copper were removed from this region during the prehistoric era. To put that into perspective, 500,000 tons is an amount of metal so vast it could have outfitted every major civilization of the Bronze Age. And yet, when we look at the archaeological record of the Americas, we find only a tiny fraction of that copper. We find beautiful ornaments, small knives, and fishhooks in the burial mounds of the Mississippi Valley, but we do not find the hundreds of millions of pounds that were pulled from the earth here. The question hangs in the air like the morning fog over the lake. Where did the copper go? We are looking back into a period of time that researchers often call the Archaic, a span of history that reaches back over 5,000 years. This was an era long before the rise of the Aztecs or the Mayans, a time when the world was still adjusting to the end of the last great ice age. Through the use of radiocarbon dating, a process that measures the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic materials, we know that these mines were active as early as 5,000 years before the Common Era. Some evidence even suggests they may have been worked during the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt cooling and geological upheaval that occurred nearly 12,000 years ago. The stratigraphy of these sites, the study of the layers of earth and debris accumulated over millennia, reveals a story of persistence, layer upon layer of charcoal and stone tools show that for thousands of years, generation after generation returned to these frozen islands. They used a method known as fire setting, building immense bonfires against the rock faces until the stone glowed red with heat, then dousing the surface with cold lake water. The resulting thermal shock would crack the basalt, a sharp crystalline sound echoing through the trees, allowing the miners to pry the native copper free with wooden levers and stone mauls. It was a labor of incredible patience, a slow, rhythmic process that mirrors the very pace of the earth itself. The copper found here is unique. It is native copper, meaning it is nearly 100% pure in its natural state. It did not require the complex smelting processes used in the Old World. It could be hammered and shaped while cold, a process known as cold working. This purity made the Lake Superior copper the most valuable resource in the ancient world, a substance that glowed like the sun and possessed a utility far beyond stone or bone. And yet, despite the thousands of mining pits and the millions of stone tools, we find no evidence of permanent cities. There are no grand palaces, no written records, and no great walls. There are only the pits and the silence. It is as if a ghost workforce inhabited the woods, a civilization that understood the geology of the earth with a precision that rivals modern science, yet chose to leave no names behind. As the years passed, the forest reclaimed the excavations. Roots wound their way through the discarded stone hammers, and the slow accumulation of leaf mulch filled the deep trenches, hiding the labor of thousands of years under a carpet of green. When we ponder the 500,000 tons of missing copper, we are forced to confront the limits of our own understanding. Mainstream archaeology suggests that the metal was traded slowly across the continent, moving hand to hand through vast networks of indigenous peoples. But others look at the sheer volume and wonder if the story is much larger, if the ancient world was far more connected than we dare to imagine. Could these shores have been visited by travelers from across the great oceans, seeking the red metal to fuel the Bronze Age of distant lands? There is a certain weight to this mystery, a feeling of standing on the edge of a great canyon and looking down into the darkness of deep time. We see the evidence of human hands, the marks of the hammers, the charcoal from the fires, and yet the people themselves remain just out of reach, like a half-remembered dream. They lived, they breathed the cold northern air, and they moved mountains of rock. And then they stepped back into the shadows of history, leaving us to wonder who they were and what they knew. As we continue our journey through the copper culture, we will look closer at the artifacts they left behind, the strange, beautiful objects that have survived the passage of 5 millennia. We will explore the geological wonders of the Keweenaw and the sunken mysteries beneath the waves of the lake. But for now, let yourself rest in the stillness of the northern wilderness. Imagine the flickering light of 1,000 campfires along the shore, the steady thrum of stone against stone, and the vast, cold water that has watched it all, silent and eternal. The mystery of the copper is a mystery of the earth itself, a reminder that we are but a brief moment in the long, unfolding story of this planet. The mines are still there, hidden beneath the ferns and the snow, waiting for someone to listen to the story they have been trying to tell for 6,000 years. Close your eyes now, and let the rhythm of the waves carry you deeper into the past, into the heart of the great northern silence. Imagine, if you will, the earth not as a solid, unchanging foundation, but as a living, breathing entity that once groaned under the weight of its own internal fires. To understand the hands that moved the stone, we must first understand the stone itself and the violent birth of the land we now call the Keweenaw Peninsula. Over 1 billion years ago, long before the first mammal drew breath, and even longer before the first human looked up at the stars in wonder, the very continent of North America began to tear itself apart. This was the birth of the mid-continent rift, a scar in the Earth's crust thousands of miles long, stretching from the heart of what is now Kansas up through the basin of Lake Superior. For millions of years, the ground buckled and split, spewing forth torrents of molten basalt from the mantle, a dark liquid fire that flooded the landscape in layer after layer of volcanic rock. As this lava cooled and hardened, it left behind tiny pockets, gas bubbles trapped in the cooling stone like frozen breaths. Deep underground, heated fluids, rich in minerals, began to circulate through these porous layers, and it is here that the true miracle of the region occurred. Unlike almost anywhere else on the planet, where copper is usually found chemically bonded with sulfur or oxygen, the unique conditions of the Lake Superior Basin allowed the metal to precipitate out in its pure elemental form. Geologists call this native copper, a substance so refined by the Earth's own alchemy that it is 99% pure when it leaves the ground. It is not an ore that requires complex smelting or chemical separation. It is simply the metal itself, waiting in the darkness, bright, malleable, and eternal. The copper formed in many shapes, sometimes as tiny grains no larger than a seed, and sometimes as massive, twisting veins that wound through the basalt like the roots of an ancient tree. In some rare instances, it formed as giant boulders, solid masses of metal weighing many tons, hidden deep within the fissures of the rift. For hundreds of millions of years, this treasure remained locked away, buried beneath miles of younger rock and the shifting debris of the passing eons. The world changed around it. Mountains rose and were ground down to dust, oceans advanced and retreated, and the great silence of deep time settled over the peninsula. Then, roughly 2 million years ago, the climate of the Earth began to fluctuate, ushering in the age of the glaciers. Massive sheets of ice, some over 2 miles thick, began to crawl southward from the Arctic, acting as a giant, slow-motion rasp against the surface of the world. These glaciers were powerful enough to carve out the very basins that would one day hold the Great Lakes. And as they moved, they scoured away the softer sedimentary rocks that had hidden the copper for so long. The ice acted as a great revealer. It plucked massive chunks of native copper from their volcanic beds and dragged them across the landscape, leaving behind what are known as float copper, heavy, weathered nuggets of pure metal scattered across the forest floor and along the rocky shorelines. When the ice finally retreated about 10,000 years ago, it left the Keweenaw Peninsula exposed, a rugged, ridged spine of volcanic rock, rich with veins of red metal that shimmered in the new sun. It is difficult for us to grasp the significance of finding such a material in a world that had only known stone, wood, and bone. To the ancient people who first wandered into these northern forests, the copper must have seemed like something from another world. It possessed physical properties that defied the logic of the Stone Age. While a flint knife might shatter if struck too hard, and a wooden spear might snap, this strange red stone was different. It was heavy, far heavier than any common rock, and it possessed a peculiar warmth to the touch. Most importantly, it was ductile. If you struck it with a hammerstone, it did not crumble into dust. It moved. It flowed. It could be folded, thinned, and shaped without ever being melted in a furnace. This process, known as cold hammering, allowed the early inhabitants of the region to create tools of unprecedented durability and sharpness. They could take a raw nugget found in a stream bed and, with patience and rhythm, beat it into the shape of a crescent-shaped knife, a projectile point, or a heavy woodworking adze. Because the copper was so pure, it didn't require the advanced metallurgical knowledge of the old world. There was no need for the massive bellows, the charcoal kilns, or the high-temperature crucibles that characterized the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean or the Near East. In the Lake Superior Basin, the transition from the Stone Age to the Metal Age happened in a way that was uniquely quiet and uniquely direct. And yet, as we look at the sheer scale of the extraction, the simplicity of the process begins to clash with the magnitude of the evidence. When the first modern surveyors and miners arrived in the 1800s, they were stunned to find that they were not the first to discover these veins. Everywhere they looked, they found ancient pits, thousands of them, some as deep as 60 feet, carved directly into the hard volcanic basalt. These were not the casual scratchings of a few nomadic hunters. They were the remains of a systematic, organized effort that spanned centuries, if not millennia. The ancient miners used a technique that was as simple as it was grueling. They would build large fires atop the copper-bearing rock, heating the stone until it glowed with a dull red heat. Then they would suddenly pour cold water from the lake onto the hot surface. The thermal shock would cause the basalt to crack and shatter with the sound of a rifle shot, exposing the veins of copper hidden within. Using massive rounded stones gathered from the beaches, some weighing over 20 pounds and fitted with wooden handles, they would pound away the loosened rock, slowly freeing the metal from its prison. As the years passed, these pits multiplied, following the veins of copper across the ridges of the Keweenaw and out onto the lonely shores of Isle Royale. The sheer volume of rock removed is staggering. Millions of tons of earth and stone moved by hand, using nothing but fire, water, and stone hammers. And here is where the mystery deepens, settling over the landscape like the thick fogs that roll off Lake Superior in the early morning. If we calculate the amount of copper that was removed from these thousands of ancient pits, the numbers reach a scale that challenges our understanding of prehistory. Estimates suggest that anywhere from 100,000 to 500,000 tons of copper were extracted from this region over a period of several thousand years. To put that in perspective, that is enough copper to supply the entire ancient world for centuries. It is an amount of metal that should have left a massive, unmistakable copper trail throughout the archaeological record of North America. We should see it in every burial mound, every village site, every trade network from the Rockies to the Atlantic. And while we do find beautiful copper artifacts in the hands of the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures, copper breastplates, delicate ear spools, and ceremonial blades, the total weight of all the ancient copper artifacts ever recovered by archaeologists accounts for only a tiny fraction of 1% of the metal that was mined. Where did the rest of it go? The earth tells us that the metal was taken. The empty pits and the millions of broken stone hammers are silent witnesses to a monumental labor. The geology of the peninsula provided the treasure, a purity of copper found nowhere else on the globe, and the retreating glaciers laid it bare for human hands to find. But as we stand on the edge of these ancient excavations, looking down into the deep, fern-choked hollows where the fires once burned, we are forced to ask if we are looking at the work of a lost local culture, or the footprint of a global enterprise that has been erased from the pages of history. The copper is gone, and as we drift further into the shadows of the past, the questions only grow louder in the silence. Imagine a world where the air is perpetually sharp with the scent of damp earth and melting ice, a landscape where the horizon is dominated not by trees, but by the retreating white walls of a dying ice age. As the Laurentide ice sheet pulled its immense weight back toward the north, it left behind a scarred and trembling earth, a terrain of raw stone and newborn lakes that had not seen the sun for 20,000 years. Into this cold, emerging wilderness stepped the first wanderers, the Paleo-Indians, following the seasonal migrations of megafauna through a land that was still finding its shape. These were people of the flint and the spear, surviving on the razor's edge of existence, but as the climate began to soften around 7,000 years ago, something fundamental shifted in their relationship with the earth beneath their feet. The transition was not sudden, but it was profound, marking a departure from the stone tool traditions that had defined human life for millennia. In the gravelly soils and the clear, icy shallows of the Great Lakes, these early inhabitants began to encounter a substance that defied the logic of stone. It was heavy, strangely warm to the touch, and when struck with a hammerstone, it did not shatter like flint or chert. Instead it flowed, it bent. It yielded to the will of the maker, revealing a brilliant, sun-like luster that must have seemed, to their eyes, like a fragment of the celestial world fallen to the dirt. This was the birth of the old copper complex, a cultural emergence that predates the great pyramids of Giza and the bronze foundries of the Near East, making these silent northern forests the site of the world's first large-scale metalworking revolution. As the years passed and the centuries bled into millennia, this obsession with the red metal transformed the very fabric of their society. We see the echoes of this change in places like the Oconto site in Wisconsin, where the earth holds the quiet remains of a people who lived nearly 6,000 years ago. Here, the stratigraphy, the layered history of the soil, reveals a startling complexity. In these ancient graves, archaeologists have found copper harpoons, crescent-shaped knives, and delicate awls, all crafted from the pure native metal of the north. It is a haunting thought to realize that while the civilizations of the Fertile Crescent were still experimenting with the most basic copper smelting, the people of the Great Lakes were already masters of cold hammering and annealing, a process of heating and cooling the metal to prevent it from becoming brittle. They were not merely using what they found, they were manipulating the very properties of the physical world. Meanwhile, at the riverside cemetery near the Menominee River, the evidence of this cultural flowering becomes even more intimate and mysterious. The graves here are not merely pits for the dead, but snapshots of a society that valued the aesthetic and the spiritual as much as the utilitarian. We find copper beads that once adorned the necks of children, and obsidian blades that had travelled hundreds of miles from the volcanic peaks of the west, suggesting a vast, interconnected world that contradicts our image of isolated, primitive bands. The presence of these materials, nestled alongside the copper, speaks of a trade network that breathed across the continent, a silent commerce of ideas and artifacts that moved through the veins of the great river systems. And so, we must wonder about the cultural significance of this metal, which seems to have been far more than a simple tool-making material. To the people of the old copper complex, copper was likely a bridge between the mundane and the divine. Its reflective surface captured the light of the sun and the flicker of the hearth, perhaps serving as a symbol of life force or status in a world where survival was a daily negotiation with the spirits of the forest and the water. The sheer volume of copper removed from the earth, hundreds of thousands of tons by some estimates, suggests a level of organization and purpose that stretches the limits of what we understand about hunter-gatherer societies. Was this a local phenomenon, a natural evolution of craft, or were these people part of something much larger, a global hunger for metal that has since been forgotten by the keepers of history? As we look closer at the artifacts, the mystery only deepens. The tools are often found in pristine condition, as if they were never intended for the rugged work of the hunt or the hearth. Some are so thin and delicate they would have buckled under the slightest pressure, suggesting they were ceremonial items, symbols of office, or perhaps offerings to the deep waters of the lakes. The radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic material, places the peak of this copper culture in a window of time that feels impossibly distant, long before the rise of the great Mississippian cities or the empires of the south. It is as if a light was switched on in the dark wilderness, burned with a brilliant intensity for 3,000 years, and then slowly began to flicker and fade. The emergence of the old copper complex challenges our linear understanding of progress. We are taught to think of history as a steady climb from stone to bronze, from bronze to iron, yet here, in the heart of North America, we find a society that leapfrogged into the metal age and then, just as mysteriously, seemed to step back from it. As the glaciers continued their long retreat and the forests matured, the people of the copper mines began to leave behind their deep pits and their heavy hammers. The metal tools that had defined their ancestors for generations became less common, replaced once again by the familiar edge of stone and the suppleness of bone. Why would a culture that had mastered the world's purest copper simply walk away from its use? Was it a change in the climate, a shift in the migration patterns of the animals they relied upon, or perhaps a spiritual reckoning with the earth they had so deeply scarred? As we drift further into the shadows of the riverside cemetery and the hollowed-out hills of Isle Royale, the silence of the past is all that remains. The copper was pulled from the stone, shaped by fire and hand, and carried across the vast reaches of a wild continent, leaving us to wonder who these master smiths truly were, and what they saw when they looked into the gleaming surface of the red metal. The questions remain buried in the silt and the ancient soil, waiting for a voice that can speak the language of the deep time that holds them. As the centuries rolled on, the memory of the great mining efforts began to dissolve into the mists of folklore and the quiet growth of the northern woods. The deep trenches, once ringing with the sound of stone on copper, were slowly reclaimed by moss and fern, hiding the evidence of an industry that had no parallel in the ancient world. It is easy to imagine a traveller 1,000 years later, walking over the very ground where thousands of men once laboured and seeing nothing but the peaceful undulation of the forest floor. Yet, beneath the roots of the towering white pines, the scars remained, vast subterranean voids where the earth's treasure had been systematically harvested. This transition back to stone and bone is one of the most baffling chapters in the story of the copper culture. In the traditional narrative of human development, once a society discovers the utility of metal, they never truly let it go. Metal is more durable, more versatile, and more easily repaired than stone. And yet, the archaeological record shows a distinct tapering off, a slow abandonment of the heavy copper axes and the complex harpoons in favour of the older ways. Perhaps the copper had become too difficult to reach, as the surface deposits were exhausted and the water tables rose within the deeper pits. Or perhaps, in the shifting spiritual landscape of the post-glacial world, the act of wounding the earth to extract its bones became a taboo, a practice that was seen as bringing imbalance to the world. We are left to contemplate the limits of what we can truly know about a people who left no written records, only the silent testimony of their tools and the empty spaces where the copper once lay. The old copper complex stands as a testament to human ingenuity and the restless spirit of exploration, a reminder that the history of the Americas is far older and far more complex than the stories we were once told. As we listen to the wind rustling through the leaves of the Wisconsin woods, we are reminded that we are walking upon the ruins of a golden age, or rather, a copper age, that flourished and fell while the rest of the world was still waking up. The mystery of the 500,000 tons of missing metal remains a shadow in the corner of our vision, a riddle wrapped in the cold, clear waters of Lake Superior, waiting for the light of a new understanding to finally break through the canopy of time. Deep within the ancient fissures of the Keweenaw Peninsula, the silence is heavy, weighted by the memory of 1,000,000 rhythmic strikes that once echoed through these hills. To understand how these archaic miners extracted such a staggering volume of metal, We must first imagine the sheer physical intimacy required to work the earth without the benefit of steel or explosives. They did not merely dig, they engaged in a slow, deliberate dialogue with the basaltic rock, a process that began with the primal element of fire. As the damp northern mists rolled off the lake, the miners would gather massive quantities of timber, stacking wood deep within the trenches and against the stubborn faces of the copper-bearing veins. They would set these pyres alight, watching as the orange glow illuminated the dark, damp walls of the pits, the heat growing so intense that it shimmered against the cold stone. When the rock reached a critical temperature, they would suddenly douse the glowing surface with hundreds of gallons of icy water drawn from the nearby streams. The resulting thermal shock was violent and immediate. A series of sharp, crystalline cracks would spider web through the host rock, shattering the grip of the earth and loosening the native copper from its stony womb. This technique, known as fire setting, was a slow and grueling dance of heat and cold, repeated day after day, week after week, until the mountain finally yielded its treasures. Once the rock was fractured, the true labor began. Scattered across the floors of these ancient mining sites, archaeologists have discovered a silent testimony to this industry. Hundreds of thousands of stone hammerstones. These are not delicate tools, but rugged, hand-sized cobbles of hard diabase or granite, often grooved in the center to allow for the attachment of sturdy wooden handles. Imagine the sound of 10,000 hammers falling at once, a percussive symphony that must have defined the atmosphere of the Great Lakes for over 1,000 years. Many of these stones are found fractured and discarded, worn down to nubs by the relentless task of pulverizing the surrounding matrix to free the heavy, ductile veins of metal. The sheer scale of these discarded tools suggests a communal effort that defies our modern understanding of tribal life. This was not the work of a few wandering prospectors, but the organized, sustained endeavor of an entire culture. Perhaps thousands of individuals working in unison to harvest the very bones of the earth. As the copper was freed from the stone, it appeared in its native form, pure, shimmering, and remarkably soft. Unlike the ores found in the Old World, which required complex smelting and high-heat furnaces to extract the metal from the rock, the Lake Superior copper was already 99% pure. It did not need to be melted to be shaped. Instead, these ancient artisans utilized a process called cold hammering. With patient, measured strokes, they would beat the raw nuggets into thin sheets or sturdy bars, slowly coaxing the metal into the shapes of spear points, knives, and crescent-shaped blades known as ulus. But copper has a memory. As it is hammered, it becomes brittle and prone to cracking, a phenomenon known as work hardening. To overcome this, the miners practiced a sophisticated technique called annealing. They would gently reheat the hammered metal in a bed of glowing coals, just enough to relax its molecular structure without melting it, before bringing it back to the anvil for further shaping. This cycle of heating and hammering, of softening and strengthening, reveals a profound metallurgical intuition, a deep, inherited knowledge of the materials that allowed them to create tools of incredible durability and beauty. The pits themselves tell a story of staggering ambition. Some of these excavations reach depths of 20 or 30 feet, cut directly into the solid backbone of the continent. To stand at the bottom of such a trench is to feel the weight of deep time pressing in from all sides. One must wonder about the logistics of such an operation, how they managed the drainage of rainwater and seepage, how they moved massive boulders weighing several tons out of the pits using only cedar levers and braided hemp ropes, and how they fed and housed the legions of workers required to maintain such an output. As the centuries drifted by, these pits became more than just industrial sites. They became scars of a lost civilization, a testament to a time when the relationship between humanity and the earth was one of profound physical struggle and exquisite craftsmanship. The metal they pulled from these depths was destined for more than just utility. It was a substance of power, a frozen spark of the sun that would travel thousands of miles across the continent, following ancient trade routes that we are only now beginning to map. The labor was not merely a means to an end, but a way of life that bound the people to the landscape in a cycle of seasonal migration. They would arrive in the spring as the ice retreated from the shores of Isle Royale and the Keweenaw, staying through the long mosquito-thick summers to toil in the pits, and departing before the first heavy snows of autumn could trap them in the frozen north. In the quiet of the modern woods, if you listen closely to the wind moving through the pines, you can almost hear the rhythmic clink of stone against stone, a ghostly echo of a time when the Great Lakes were the industrial heart of a world we have largely forgotten. The evidence is there, etched into the very topography of the land, yet it remains a riddle. Why did they stop? Why did this massive industry, which had persisted for millennia, suddenly vanish into the mists of history, leaving behind only their broken hammers and the deep, silent trenches? We are left to wander through the overgrown pits, stepping over the moss-covered debris of 1,000 years of labor, searching for a sign, a word, or a reason for their departure. But the rocks remain silent, and the copper they left behind sits cold and dark, cradled in the earth like a secret that was never meant to be told. As the shadows lengthen over the copper country, we are reminded that our understanding of human history is often like the stratigraphy of these mines, layers of effort and innovation buried beneath the slow accumulation of forest floor and fallen leaves. We look at the 500,000 tons of missing metal, and we see a void, a gap in our story that demands to be filled. But perhaps the answer lies not in where the copper went, but in the spirit of the people who stayed, who breathed the wood smoke and felt the vibration of the hammerstones in their very bones. They worked with a patience that our modern world has forgotten, a measured pace that respected the limits of the stone and the temper of the metal. In their world, every tool was a testament to a communal struggle, a piece of the earth transformed by human will and the ancient power of fire. And so, the mystery persists, not as a problem to be solved, but as a presence to be felt, a lingering hum in the air of the northern woods that speaks of a time when the world was vast, the copper was pure, and the deep time of the earth was the only clock that mattered. The weight of a cold, smooth object held in the palm of a hand has a way of bridging the vast gulf of 5,000 years. Imagine, if you will, the sensation of a copper fishhook, small, curved, and surprisingly heavy for its size, resting against your skin. It is not merely a piece of metal, but a silent witness to a morning long forgotten, when the mist clung to the surface of Lake Superior, and a lone fisherman waited for a tug on a line of braided plant fibre. This was the reality of the copper culture, where the abstract beauty of the raw ore was tethered firmly to the demands of survival. As we look closer at the artifacts recovered from the silts and sands of the Great Lakes, we see a mastery of form that evolved with a slow, patient grace. The earliest tools were born of necessity, heavy, functional, and unadorned. There are harpoons with jagged barbs designed to hold fast in the thrashing cold of the deep water, and knives with thick spines that could withstand the pressure of butchering a caribou or a moose. These were the utilitarian foundations of a society that understood the earth not as a resource to be exploited, but as a provider to be respected. The spear points, some long and leaf-shaped, others socketed to fit perfectly onto a wooden shaft, show a deep understanding of physics and balance. They were cold-hammered into existence, the metal folded and beaten until it achieved a hardness that stone could never replicate. Yet as the centuries turned into millennia, the relationship between the people and the copper began to shift. The metal started to take on a life beyond the hunt. we begin to see the emergence of the ulu, or the crescent-shaped knife, a tool of such elegant simplicity that its design has remained virtually unchanged in some northern cultures to this day. In the hands of the copper culture, these crescents became more than just implements for slicing hide or fish. They became symbols. Some are so thin, so finely worked, that they seem too delicate for the rigors of daily labor. They suggest a transition from the purely functional to the ceremonial, a moment in time where a tool becomes a badge of office or a token of a person standing within the wandering bands of the north. This evolution of design tells a story of a people who were no longer merely surviving, but were beginning to weave their identity into the very fabric of the materials they gathered. Along with the knives and hooks, we find decorative gorgets, flat plates of beaten copper, worn against the chest, catching the light of the fire or the midday sun. These gorgets were often shaped into crescents or simple geometric forms, and they represent a profound shift in human consciousness. To create something purely for its aesthetic or symbolic value is to acknowledge a world beyond the immediate need for food and shelter. It is an act of artistry that speaks to the soul. The mystery deepens when we compare these two worlds, the utilitarian and the ritualistic. In the same burial sites, one might find a tattered, well-used copper awl, scarred from years of piercing leather, resting beside a pristine, oversized spear point that appears never to have tasted blood. Why would a culture invest so much effort into mining and shaping 500,000 tons of metal, only to bury a significant portion of it beneath the earth? Perhaps the act of returning the copper to the ground was as important as taking it out. In the logic of deep time, the metal was a gift from the spirits of the underworld, a loan that eventually had to be repaid. As we track the stratigraphy, that is, the study of the layers of earth that act as a chronological record of the past, we see the subtle changes in how these objects were crafted over 3,000 years. The early archaic period favored heavy, solid forms, while the later stages of the culture show an increasing fascination with thinness and decorative detail. It is a slow-motion transformation, a gradual awakening of artistic impulse that mirrored the changing climate and the shifting forests. The tools grew more specialized, reflecting a diet that expanded to include a wider variety of fish and small game, as the glaciers retreated further north and the land warmed. There is a quiet dignity in these objects. A copper needle, still sharp enough to prick a finger after 40 centuries, reminds us that the people of the copper culture were not primitive in the way we often imagine. They were engineers of the tactile world. They understood the grain of the metal, the way it would crack if worked too cold, and the way it would soften if held in the glowing embers of a hardwood fire. This process, known as annealing, was their greatest secret, a way to manipulate the very molecular structure of the Earth's bones. And yet, for all their technical skill, there is an absence of the monumental. They did not build great cities of stone or towering pyramids. Their legacy is found in the small things, the things that could be carried in a leather pouch or worn around the neck. This portability suggests a life of constant motion, a rhythmic migration that followed the seasons and the movements of the animals. The copper was their constant companion, a sliver of the sun held in the hand, guiding them through the dense primeval forests. Meanwhile, the sheer volume of the metal extracted remains a silent enigma, a staggering amount of work for a people who seemingly lived such a light, nomadic existence. When we hold a copper harpoon head today, we are touching a bridge across time. We are feeling the same weight and the same coldness that a hunter felt 5 millennia ago. The artistry involved was not a separate pursuit, but a way of life, a belief that even the most humble fishhook deserved to be beautiful. It was a world where the line between the sacred and the profane was thin, and where every tool was infused with a fragment of the spirit of the copper itself. As the firelight flickered against the walls of their shelters, reflecting off the polished surfaces of their tools, They must have wondered, as we do, about the origins of this strange red stone that came from the heart of the Great Lake. The transition from stone to metal was not a sudden revolution, but a long, lingering conversation between the craftsman and the material. In the quiet of the northern woods, that conversation continues. Every artifact recovered is a word in a language we are still trying to translate, a language of heat and hammer, of utility and grace. As the years passed and the copper culture eventually faded into the mists of history, they left behind these fragments of their identity, silent, metallic echoes of a time when the world was young and the relationship between man and the earth was written in the enduring glow of native copper. The mystery of who they were and why they labored so intensely remains buried in the deep time of the Great Lakes, waiting for the earth to yield its next secret. The scent of damp earth and river silt often tells a story that the wind cannot carry. Imagine a single nugget of copper, smoothed by the rhythmic hands of a craftsman, on the shores of Lake Superior, beginning a journey that would span thousands of miles and outlive the memory of its maker. This metal did not remain confined to the cold northern reaches of the Great Lakes. Instead, it moved like a slow metallic tide across the vast expanse of the North American continent, tracing the veins of the earth along the paths of least resistance. The mystery of the 500,000 tons of missing copper takes on a new dimension when we look away from the pits of Isle Royale and toward the distant horizons of the south and west. Archaeologists, through the careful study of stratigraphy, the layering of history within the soil, have uncovered these northern treasures in places where they simply should not be. We find the distinct, high-purity copper of the Keweenaw Peninsula resting in the humid soil of the Gulf Coast and tucked away within the rugged shadows of the Rocky Mountains. It is as if the continent itself was once bound together by a web of copper threads, a network of exchange so vast and so ancient that it challenges our modern understanding of how early societies interacted. This was not a world of isolated tribes living in total seclusion, but rather a landscape connected by what we might call the Great Continental Trade Network. As the centuries drifted by, the waterways became the ancient highways of this hidden world, the immense volume of metal being moved, hundreds of millions of pounds over the course of millennia, could not have been carried on the backs of men alone. Instead, we must envision the steady, rhythmic dipping of paddles into the glass-like surfaces of the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Ohio rivers. Heavy dugout canoes, laden with the weight of raw ore and finished tools, would have glided silently through the morning mists, navigating the complex arterial system of the continent to reach distant markets and ceremonial centers. Among the most prominent keepers of this copper were the people of the Hopewell tradition and, later, the Mississippian cultures. These were the great mound builders, societies that flourished in the river valleys of the American Midwest and Southeast. To them, the copper from the north was not merely a utility for survival, but a substance of profound spiritual and social significance. In the burial mounds of the Hopewell, researchers have found exquisite copper breastplates, intricate headpieces shaped like the antlers of a deer, and delicate cutouts of human hands and birds. These objects, shimmering with an otherworldly light, were often placed alongside the dead, serving perhaps as a bridge between the physical world and the eternal silence of the afterlife. The Hopewellian influence stretched across a staggering distance, and their reliance on Lake Superior copper suggests a sophisticated level of organization. They were the middlemen of a prehistoric economy, a culture that valued the rare and the beautiful above the common. But what did the northern miners receive in exchange for their heavy burdens of metal? Trade is rarely a one-way street, and the evidence suggests a vibrant, two-way flow of exotic goods that would have seemed like magic to those living in the cold shadows of the north. While copper moved south, other treasures moved north. In the same archaeological sites where northern copper is found, we also discover shells from the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, large spiraling whelks and delicate marginella that had been carried over 2,000 miles to reach the Great Lakes. We find obsidian, the volcanic glass of the far west, transported from the Yellowstone region to the mounds of Ohio. There is a quiet beauty in the thought of a northern miner, his hands calloused from the stone hammers of the copper pits, holding a smooth, iridescent seashell that still carried the faint memory of a tropical sun. This exchange reflects a deep-seated human desire for connection and the pursuit of things that are other. The copper was exchanged for grizzly bear teeth from the Rockies, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, and fine flint from distant quarries. These were the luxury goods of the ancient world, the symbols of status and the tools of the shaman. The sheer scale of this movement suggests that the copper culture was not a localized phenomenon, but the beating heart of a continental system that functioned for thousands of years before the first European keel ever touched the Atlantic sands. As we contemplate the logistics of such a network, we must consider the passage of deep time. This was not a trade that happened in a single generation, but a slow, creeping expansion of influence that unfolded over 5,000 years. The waterways provided the infrastructure, but the motivation remains a subject of quiet speculation. Was this trade driven by necessity or by a shared cosmology that placed a high value on the red metal of the north? Some suggest that the copper represented the blood of the earth, a sacred substance that had to be shared across the land to maintain the balance of the world. The Mississippian cultures, which rose to prominence as the Hopewell faded, continued this tradition of copper use, though their style shifted toward more complex, embossed plates depicting warriors and avian deities. These artifacts, found at sites like Etowah in Georgia or Spiro in Oklahoma, provide a clear chemical fingerprint that leads directly back to the shores of Lake Superior. The purity of the native copper, often 99% pure, makes it easy to identify through modern spectrographic analysis. It acts as a silent witness, proving that the metal found in a grave in the deep south was once part of a vein of ore buried beneath the northern pines. One cannot help but wonder about the travelers who navigated these routes. Did they possess maps etched into birch bark, or did they carry the geography of the continent in their minds, passed down through songs and stories told around 1,000 campfires? The portages between river systems would have been well-worn paths, places where different languages mingled and news from distant lands was shared. In these moments of exchange, the world became a smaller, more intimate place. The copper functioned as a universal language, a medium of value that everyone understood, regardless of their tribe or tongue. And yet, despite the clarity of the trade routes, the sheer volume of the missing copper remains an unsettling mystery. Even when we account for all the breastplates in the mounds and all the tools found in the fields, we still fall far short of the 500,000 tons estimated to have been removed from the northern mines. Where did the rest of it go? Did it vanish into the earth through corrosion, or is there a vast undiscovered treasury of ancient metal still waiting to be found? Or perhaps, as some more fringe theories suggest, the network extended even further, reaching across the great oceans to civilizations we have yet to link to the North American wilderness. Mainstream archaeology remains cautious, preferring to look at the evidence within the confines of the continent. And the evidence we have is already breathtaking. It paints a picture of a sophisticated, interconnected ancient America that was far more complex than the primitive labels we often give it. It was a world of long-distance diplomacy, of specialized labor, and of a deep, abiding respect for the materials provided by the earth. As the sun sets over the modern industrial ruins of the Keweenaw, it is easy to forget that these same hills were once the center of a thriving continental economy. The quiet rivers that now carry recreational kayakers once bore the weight of a civilization's wealth. The copper remains, hidden in the soil of a dozen states, a testament to a time when the entire continent was linked by a single glowing red metal. The mystery of the miners may remain unsolved, but the legacy of their labor is written across the map of the ancient world, etched in shells, stone, and the enduring gleam of Lake Superior copper. The silence of the northern woods is often deceptive, a heavy blanket of pine needles and moss that masks the scars of an industry so vast it defies our modern understanding of the ancient world. If you were to walk through the dense forests of Isle Royale or the rugged spine of the Keweenaw Peninsula today, you might see nothing more than the occasional dip in the earth, a shallow depression filled with rainwater and fallen leaves. But beneath that soft forest floor lies a staggering mathematical puzzle that has haunted historians and engineers for decades. In the mid-20th century, a man named Octave du Temple, an engineer and the executive director of the American Nuclear Society, became fascinated by these depressions. He realized they were not natural features of the landscape, but rather the remnants of thousands of prehistoric open-pit mines. As he and his colleagues began to map the sheer density of these excavations, a haunting question began to take shape. How much metal had actually been removed from this earth, and where did it all go? To answer this, Du Temple and other researchers began a meticulous evaluation of the thousands of pits scattered across the Copper Range. They measured the depth of the excavations, the width of the veins, and the density of the glacial till that had to be cleared away to reach the pure native copper beneath. This was not the work of a few wandering nomads looking for trinkets. This was a systematic, multi-generational extraction project that spanned thousands of years. As the calculations began to coalesce, the numbers became almost impossible to reconcile with the traditional story of North American prehistory. By estimating the cubic feet of rock removed from the pits and comparing it to the known percentage of copper found in those specific veins, researchers arrived at a figure that sends a shiver through the halls of academia. They estimated that between 500,000 and 1.5 billion pounds of copper were extracted from the Lake Superior region during the Archaic period. That is 500,000 tons of high-grade metal vanished into the mists of time. The weight of that number is difficult to grasp. 500,000 tons. It represents millions of man-hours, a constant rhythm of stone hammers striking cold rock, the crackle of fires used to heat the stone, and the sudden hiss of cold water poured over the heat to shatter the grip of the earth. It suggests an industrial output that rivals the great civilizations of the Mediterranean and the Near East. And yet, when archaeologists look at the record of the copper culture in the Americas, they find a profound and unsettling discrepancy. If you were to gather every copper spear point, every crescent-shaped knife, every bead and bracelet ever recovered from the burial mounds and village sites of the entire North American continent, you would barely reach a few tons of metal. The vast majority of those 500,000 tons is simply missing. It is not in the museums. It is not buried in the mounds of the Mississippi Valley. It is not resting in the caches of the Great Lakes. The math creates a void, a silent canyon in our history, where a massive fortune of copper should be but isn't. This discrepancy has led to the development of complex mathematical models where researchers attempt to account for the loss of metal through oxidation, recycling, or deep burial. But even the most conservative models cannot bridge the gap. They look at the 4,000 years of active mining and try to distribute the labor. They imagine small groups of miners working seasonally, perhaps taking only what they could carry. But even then, the sheer volume of the pits tells a different story. The earth does not lie about what has been taken from it. The empty space in the rock is a permanent record of a harvest, a ledger written in the negative space of the cliffs. As the years passed, these high-end estimates became the center of a swirling controversy. To accept that 500,000 tons of copper were mined is to accept that there was a destination for that metal that we have not yet identified. It suggests a global trade network that predates our recorded history, or perhaps a civilization on the American continent that was far more populous and organized than we dare to imagine. Meanwhile, mainstream science often looks at these figures with a skeptical eye, suggesting that perhaps the pits were not as deep as they seemed, or that the copper veins were not as rich. They argue that the math might be inflated by assuming every pit was worked to its maximum capacity. And yet, even if we were to cut the estimate in half, and then in half again, we are still left with an amount of copper that far exceeds the known artifacts of the ancient Americas. The mystery deepens when we consider the purity of the metal. Lake Superior copper is unique on the planet. It is 99% pure, requiring no smelting to be worked. It carries a chemical signature, a fingerprint of trace elements, that should make it easy to track as it moved through the ancient world. If this metal was traded across the oceans, it should be sitting in the bronze alloys of the old world, hidden in the swords of Mycenaean kings or the tools of Egyptian architects. And so, we are left with a ghost industry. We see the footprints of the miners. We see the tools they left behind, the thousands of heavy stone hammers worn smooth by a lifetime of labor, and we see the gaping wounds in the earth where the copper once rested. But the copper itself has become a phantom. It is as if a great ship had been built and launched, only for us to find the empty dry dock and no trace of the vessel on any sea. The mathematical models continue to be debated in quiet academic journals and around the flickering fires of modern-day copper hunters. Some see the 500,000-ton figure as a fantasy, a miscalculation of the geological evidence. Others see it as the most important clue we have to a forgotten chapter of human history, a chapter where the Americas were not an isolated wilderness, but a vital engine of the Bronze Age. As we ponder these vast quantities of metal, we must also think of the people who performed the work. To mine such an amount requires more than just strength. It requires a sophisticated social structure. Someone had to feed the miners. Someone had to manufacture the thousands of stone hammers, which were often brought from miles away. Someone had to manage the logistics of transporting the heavy loads of ore down the rugged trails to the waiting canoes. It suggests a landscape that was humming with activity, a continent that was awake and interconnected in ways we are only beginning to perceive. The quiet of the Lake Superior woods today is a relatively recent phenomenon. For thousands of years, these hills would have echoed with the sounds of industry, the air thick with the smoke of 1,000 mining fires. The controversy surrounding the 500,000-ton calculation is not just about numbers. It is about the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. If the high estimates are true, then our understanding of ancient history is not just incomplete, it is missing its foundation. The missing copper represents a missing link in the chain of human civilization, a golden age that left its mark in the stone but vanished from the memory of the world. We are left to wander the edges of these ancient pits, looking down into the darkness and wondering whose hands reached into that earth. We look at the maps of Octave du Temple and see a landscape transformed by human ambition, a testament to a time when the red metal of the north was the most precious substance on earth. The math remains, cold and unyielding, pointing toward a truth that remains just out of reach, buried under the slow accumulation of 4,000 years of falling leaves. As the wind sighs through the cedars of the Keweenaw, it carries the faint metallic scent of the earth, a reminder that the story is not yet over. The copper is still there, some of it still waiting in the deep veins, while the rest exists somewhere else. perhaps as dust in the soil of a distant land, or as a silent witness in a forgotten tomb, its glow dimmed by the passage of ages, but its weight still felt in the heavy silence of the northern wild. To look upon a map of the ancient world is to see a series of isolated islands of civilization, separated by vast, churning oceans that we are told no one dared to cross. But as the fog rolls in over the cold waters of Lake Superior, a different possibility begins to take shape in the mind, a whisper of a connection that spans the Atlantic, binding the rugged shores of Michigan to the sun-drenched palaces of the Mediterranean. The mystery of the missing copper, those hundreds of thousands of tons of nearly pure metal extracted from the earth, creates a vacuum in our understanding of history. And nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. If the indigenous populations of the Great Lakes used only a fraction of what was mined, where did the rest of it go? As the years passed, some researchers began to look eastward toward the great sea of the Old World, where a sudden and dramatic shift in human technology was taking place. This was the dawn of the Bronze Age, a time when the world was being forged anew in the heat of the furnace. To create bronze, one requires a delicate marriage of metals, roughly 9 parts copper to 1 part tin. In the second millennium before the Common Era, the demand for these materials in Europe and the Near East was insatiable. It was the oil of the ancient world, the foundation of empires, the edge of every sword and the shimmer of every royal vessel. The Minoans of Crete, with their sprawling labyrinthine palaces, and the Phoenicians, those master mariners of the Levant, were the undisputed lords of the sea. They were driven by a hunger for resources that pushed their cedarwood ships further and further into the unknown, past the Pillars of Hercules, and out into the terrifying expanse of the great Western Ocean. The timing of this European hunger aligns with a curious precision to the peak of the mining activity in the Lake Superior Basin. Between the years of 2400 and 1200 before the Common Era, the pits of Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula were alive with the sound of stone hammers striking rock. This period, known as the Archaic in North America, mirrors the rise and fall of the great Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean. It is a coincidence that has led many to wonder if the Atlantic was not a barrier, but a bridge, a highway for daring navigators who followed the stars and the currents to a land they called by another name. This perspective is often called hyper-diffusionism, the idea that great cultural and technological leaps were spread by a few seafaring civilizations rather than developing independently in isolated pockets. In this version of the story, the copper of Michigan did not stay in the woods. Instead, it was carried in heavy bundles to the shores of the Atlantic, loaded onto deep-hulled ships, and sailed across the grey wastes of the sea to feed the hungry forges of the East. It is a compelling image, the sight of a Minoan galley, its sail a bright splash of colour against the dark pines of the northern wilderness. But such a bold claim requires more than just a sense of wonder. It requires the cold, hard evidence of science. Researchers have turned to a technique known as lead isotope analysis to settle the matter. Every copper deposit in the world carries a unique chemical signature, a thumbprint left by the Earth itself during the cooling of the planet's crust millions of years ago. By analyzing the ratios of lead isotopes within an ancient bronze artifact, scientists can, in theory, trace that metal back to the very mine from which it was birthed. For decades, the search has been on for a Michigan signature in the museums of Europe. Thousands of bronze tools, oxide ingots, and ceremonial daggers from the Mediterranean have been tested. The results are a tapestry of complexity. While many artifacts can be traced to mines in Cyprus, the Alps, or the British Isles, there remains a small, stubborn percentage of bronze whose origin remains unknown, a ghost in the data. Some proponents of the Atlantic crossing theory point to these anomalies as the smoking gun, the silent proof that North American copper was indeed circulating in the markets of the Bronze Age world. Yet, the mainstream scientific community remains cautious, tethered to the principle of parsimony, the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. They argue that the lack of clear Mediterranean shipwrecks in the St. Lawrence River, or the absence of Old World pottery and inscriptions in the Michigan mining pits, makes the diffusionist theory a bridge too far. They suggest that the missing copper might not be missing at all, but was simply oxidized by the acidic soil over thousands of years, or perhaps traded in small amounts across the vast networks of the Mississippi Valley until it was lost to the passage of time. And so, we find ourselves at a crossroads of interpretation. On one side, we have the traditional view of a localized, indigenous industry that operated on a scale we struggle to comprehend. On the other, we have a vision of a globalized ancient world, where the boundaries of the map were much larger than we dare to admit. Both possibilities are shrouded in the same deep time, the same silence of the northern woods. As we ponder these connections, we must consider the nature of the lake itself. The indigenous peoples of the region called it Gichigami, the Great Sea. To them, it was not merely a body of water, but a powerful, living entity that demanded respect and offerings. If foreign mariners did indeed find their way into these waters, they would have encountered a landscape that felt both ancient and alien, a place where the very rocks seemed to pulse with a hidden power. The critics of the diffusionist perspective remind us that to credit outsiders with the achievements of the copper culture can be a way of diminishing the ingenuity of the people who lived there for millennia. They point to the sophisticated cold hammering techniques used by the local tribes, a method that treated the native copper as a malleable stone rather than a molten liquid. This was a unique technology, born of the specific properties of the Lake Superior metal, which is so pure it does not require the complex smelting processes used in Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, the mystery of the volume remains. 500 million pounds of copper is an amount that defies easy explanation. It is enough to arm every soldier in the ancient world, to roof every temple, and still have enough remaining to pave the streets of a city. If it was not taken across the sea, then the North American continent must hold a secret treasury of metal yet to be discovered, perhaps buried beneath the mounds of the Ohio Valley, or resting at the bottom of the Great Lakes themselves, swallowed by the waves during a long-forgotten storm. In the quiet of the night, when the wind dies down and the surface of the lake becomes a dark, polished mirror, the distance between the two worlds seems to shrink. We are left to wonder about the limits of human ambition and the true extent of our ancestors' reach. Did the Minoans truly see the northern lights reflecting off the copper-rich cliffs of the Keweenaw? Or is the story of the copper culture a purely American epic, an incredible feat of industry performed by a people whose names have been erased by the cycles of the earth? The evidence remains elusive, tucked away in the stratigraphy of the soil, the layers of history that accumulate like dust on an old shelf. We look for answers in the radiocarbon dating of charcoal found in the pits, or in the microscopic traces of pollen trapped in the lake sediment, searching for a sign of a sudden influx of people, or a change in the environment that might signal the arrival of a foreign fleet. But the earth is a jealous guardian of its secrets. It covers the scars of the mines with moss and fern. It wears down the stone hammers into smooth pebbles, and it whispers only in the language of the wind and the water. As we drift deeper into the heart of this mystery, we realize that the who may be less important than the why. Whether it was a local endeavor or a global trade, the effort required to extract that much metal from the frozen ground of the north speaks to a profound human drive, a need to reach into the dark places of the world and pull out something that shines. The copper remains a silent witness to that drive, a heavy, metallic heart beating beneath the roots of the forest, waiting for the next age to tell its story. To understand the true nature of this ancient industry, we must listen to the voices that have echoed across the Great Lakes for 1,000 generations, carried on the wind that rustles through the cedar and the birch. Long before the first European surveyor set foot on the rugged shores of Isle Royale, the Anishinaabe people, the Ojibwe, knew of the treasures held within the red rock. They did not view the copper as a mere commodity or a resource to be stripped away for profit. To them, it was mispubik, a sacred substance that belonged to the earth itself. It was the blood of the land, a gift from the spirits that required respect, ceremony, and a deep understanding of the balance between the human world and the unseen. The legends of the Anishinaabe tell of the Mishipeshu, the great lynx, a powerful water spirit with scales of copper and a tail like a serpent. It was said that the Mishipeshu guarded the copper deposits, lurking in the churning depths of Lake Superior and the hidden caves of the islands. To take the copper was to enter into a contract with these guardians. The elders speak of the Old Ones, a people who lived in the dawn of time, who understood the language of the stones. These ancestors did not just mine the earth, they spoke to it. They would offer tobacco and prayers before lifting a hammerstone, asking permission from the spirits of the islands to take a small piece of the earth's strength. In the cultural memory of the Ojibwe, the copper was alive. It possessed a spirit of its own, and to work it was a high spiritual calling that bridged the gap between the physical and the divine. As we look at the vast pits and the hundreds of thousands of tons of missing ore, we find that this traditional knowledge aligns with the archaeological timeline in ways that are both startling and profound. While modern science uses radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to determine the age of organic materials, to place the height of the copper culture between 6,000 and 3,000 years ago, the oral traditions have always maintained that their ancestors were there, witnessing the retreat of the great ice sheets. They tell of a time when the world was different, when the waters of the Great Lakes were much higher and the land was still rising from the weight of the glaciers. This era, known to geologists as the post-glacial rebound, matches the descriptions found in stories passed down through the centuries. The Old Ones were not a myth to the Anishinaabe. They were the grandfathers and grandmothers who mastered the art of the cold-hammered metal when the world was still young and the forests were just beginning to take root in the scoured earth. There is a quiet dignity in the way these stories describe the mining process. It was not an act of conquest, but one of careful extraction. The elders speak of how the copper was found in its pure native state, shining like fallen stars in the creek beds and along the wave-beaten cliffs. They did not need complex smelting or high-heat furnaces to separate the metal from the rock. The earth had already done that work through the slow, agonizing pressure of deep time. The people followed the veins of copper deep into the ground, using fire and water to crack the stubborn basalt. They would light great fires against the rock face until it glowed with heat, then dash cold lake water against the stone, causing it to shatter with a sound like thunder. This technique, though primitive by modern standards, allowed them to reach depths that seem impossible for a culture without iron tools. It was a labor of patience, a rhythmic, meditative process that mirrored the cycles of the seasons. The spiritual nature of the metal meant that it was often used for sacred objects, thin, shimmering pendants shaped like the crescent moon, or heavy, functional tools that were treated with the reverence of family heirlooms. These items were not just tools, they were vessels of power. When a hunter carried a copper spear point, he was carrying the strength of the Mishipeshu and the protection of the spirits. When a healer used a copper knife, the metal itself was believed to possess purifying qualities. This connection to the sacred may explain why so much of the copper seems to have vanished from the archaeological record. If the metal was seen as a gift from the earth, perhaps it was eventually returned to the earth, buried in secret caches or offered back to the deep waters of the lake when its purpose was served. The cultural memory of the old ones suggests a society that was deeply integrated with its environment, where the act of mining was a sacred dialogue rather than an industrial exploitation. As the centuries drifted by, the climate began to shift. The once plentiful veins of surface copper became harder to find, and the great pits were slowly reclaimed by the moss and the creeping vines of the North Woods. The Anishinaabe tell of a time when the spirits of the islands withdrew, and the knowledge of the deep mining began to fade into the mists of legend. Yet the reverence for the copper remained, even into the historical period when early explorers encountered the tribes of Lake Superior. They noted the presence of large boulders of native copper that were treated as manitus, powerful spirits. These massive lumps of metal were wrapped in fine furs and kept in places of honor, not for their value as a resource, but for their significance as remnants of a golden age. When we consider the sheer scale of the prehistoric mining operations, the millions of pounds of metal that were moved across the continent, we must ask ourselves if our modern definitions of civilization are too narrow. We often look for stone cities and written records, but the Anishinaabe perspective offers a different kind of record. It is a record written in the landscape, in the names of the places, and in the stories that have survived the passage of 4,000 years. The old ones did not need to build monuments of stone because the earth itself was their monument. Their legacy is not found in crumbling walls, but in the silence of the ancient pits and the enduring presence of the copper that still rests beneath the roots of the pines. The alignment between Indigenous oral history and the physical evidence of archaeology creates a bridge across the vast gulf of time. It reminds us that the people who worked these mines were not nameless shadows in a textbook, but a vibrant, complex society with a deep philosophical understanding of their place in the universe. They saw the copper as a bridge between the dark, heavy earth and the bright, ethereal sky. As we walk through the forests of the Keweenaw Peninsula today, we are walking over the footprints of those who saw the world as a living, breathing entity. The mystery of who mined the copper may be partially solved by looking at the people who never left, those who still carry the songs and the stories of the metal in their hearts. In the quiet of the northern night, when the aurora borealis dances over the cold waters of Superior, one can almost hear the rhythmic thud of the hammerstones echoing from the past. It is a sound that transcends the boundaries of time, a reminder of a period when the human spirit was intimately entwined with the mysteries of the earth. The Indigenous perspective invites us to look beyond the numbers and the tonnages, to see the copper not as a mystery to be solved, but as a story to be honored. It is a story of survival, of craftsmanship, and of a profound respect for the gifts of the natural world, a story that continues to resonate in the copper-veined rocks and the deep, dark waters of the greatest of lakes. A single jagged piece of float copper lies undisturbed on the forest floor, half buried by the slow accumulation of pine needles and damp earth. For nearly 2,000 years, the rhythmic sound of stone hammers striking the living rock had defined the heartbeat of the Lake Superior basin, but then, quite suddenly in the grand scale of deep time, the hammers fell silent. Around 1000 BCE, a stillness settled over the Keweenaw Peninsula and the rocky outcrops of Isle Royale that would persist for centuries. The great pits, some reaching 20 feet into the earth, were left to fill with rainwater and drifting leaves. The intricate networks of timber supports began their long, slow process of decay, and the knowledge of the deep veins seemed to slip away like mist over the water. This period, known to those who study the layers of the past as the Great Cessation, remains one of the most profound enigmas of ancient North America, a quiet curtain drawn across a golden age of metallurgy. As we look back through the lens of stratigraphy, the study of how soil and artifacts layer over time, we see a distinct line in the earth. Below this line, the soil is rich with copper debris, scrapers, and the elegant fish hooks of an industrious people. Above it, the copper vanishes. It is as if a light was extinguished. The transition is startling in its completeness, marking a shift from a complex, metal-using society back to a reliance on stone, bone, and wood. We must wonder what could cause a people to walk away from a resource that had defined their identity for 3 millennia. Perhaps the earth itself began to signal a change. During this era, the climate of the northern hemisphere underwent a subtle but significant cooling. The lush summers grew shorter, and the winters, already formidable in the Great Lakes region, became longer and more punishing. The energy required to survive, to hunt, to gather, and to keep the hearth fires burning, may have simply outweighed the energy required to mine the deep copper. In the silence of the woods, one can almost feel the weight of that decision. It may not have been a single dramatic exodus, but a slow, weary realization that the bounty of the earth was becoming harder to reach. Some researchers suggest resource exhaustion played a role, not because the copper was gone, for millions of tons remain beneath the soil to this day, but because the easily accessible surface deposits, the low-hanging fruit of the geological world, had been depleted. To go deeper required more wood for fire setting, more labor for hauling, and more food to sustain the miners. In a world where the climate was tightening its grip, the cost of the metal may have become too high a price to pay. And so, the great trade networks that once carried superior copper as far south as the Gulf of Mexico began to fray and snap. The shimmering trade goods that once marked status and spiritual power were replaced by the familiar, reliable edges of flint and chert. This shift back to stone tools is often viewed by modern eyes as a regression, a step backward in the march of progress, but the indigenous perspective offers a different interpretation. It may have been a conscious choice towards sustainability, a return to a more mobile and flexible way of life that was better suited to a changing environment. As the years passed, the social structures that supported large-scale mining operations, the specialized craftsmen, the long-distance traders, the overseers of the pits, likely dissolved. People may have migrated, following the deer and the caribou toward more temperate lands, carrying with them only the stories of the copper, rather than the heavy weight of the metal itself. The social upheaval of such a transition would have been immense, a restructuring of reality that echoed through the oral traditions of the tribes that remained. The Great Cessation is not merely a gap in the archaeological record. It is a testament to the fragility of human systems when faced with the slow, grinding power of nature. Radiocarbon dating, the method of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic matter, confirms this quietude across hundreds of sites. The charcoal from the last fires in the mining pits dates consistently to this 3,000-year-old horizon. After that, the fire pits grow cold. The silence that followed was not a lack of life, but a change in its rhythm. The Great Lakes remained a home to many, but the relationship with the red metal had moved from the physical realm into the world of shadow and spirit. The copper was still there, pulsing beneath the roots of the cedar trees, but the hands that once shaped it had turned their attention to the immediate needs of a cooling world. One cannot help but imagine the last miner to leave Isle Royale, perhaps pausing by the shore of the Great Lake to look back at the scarred earth. Did they know they were the last, or did they believe they would return when the winters grew mild again? As the centuries turned into millennia, the forests reclaimed the pits, Moss carpeted the discarded hammerstones, and the pits themselves became small, hidden ponds where frogs sang in the spring. The memory of the 500,000 tons of copper extracted by ancient hands became a secret kept by the soil, a mystery that would wait in the darkness for thousands of years before being rediscovered by a new era of explorers who could scarcely believe what they found. The abandonment of the mines reminds us that history is not a straight line, but a series of pulses, of breaths taken and held. The Great Cessation was a long, deep exhale. It serves as a reminder of the limits of what we know and the vastness of what we have forgotten. We see the tools, we see the empty veins, and we see the sudden end, but the internal lives of those who walked away remain shielded from us. They moved into a new way of being, leaving the copper to rest in the cold embrace of the northern earth. Meanwhile, the Great Lakes continued to churn, their waves washing over the rocky shores, slowly erasing the footprints of a civilization that had once commanded the very bones of the planet. As we drift further into the history of this land, we must accept that some questions may never be answered by a trowel or a laboratory. The transition from the copper culture to the later woodland periods is a bridge built of shadows. It suggests a world where human ambition is always in dialogue with the environment, and sometimes the environment has the final word. The cooling winds and the thinning forests dictated a new path, one that led away from the deep pits and back to the simplicity of the hunt and the seasonal camp. And so, the copper remained, a silent witness to the passing of ages, waiting in the dark, cold ground for a time when the world would once again hunger for its red glow. The sound of a heavy hammer striking stone echoes through the dense, humid woods of the Upper Peninsula, a sound that would have been familiar to the spirits of the past. Yet in 1841, it signaled the arrival of a new era. For centuries, the copper had rested in a state of quiet suspension, wrapped in the roots of cedar and pine, hidden beneath blankets of snow and the soft, decaying needles of the forest floor. But as the 19th century progressed, a new hunger began to stir in the young American nation, a desire for the raw materials of industry that would lead men back to the edge of the world's largest freshwater sea. The catalyst for this sudden awakening was a single massive fragment of history known as the Ontonagon boulder. It was a 3,000-pound mass of nearly pure copper, resting in the shallows of the Ontonagon River, polished by millennia of rushing water until it shone like a fallen star against the dark riverbed. When the geologist Douglas Houghton first reported on the mineral riches of the Keweenaw Peninsula, he sparked a fever that rivaled the later gold rushes of the West. Men flooded into the wilderness, braving the black flies and the brutal winters, driven by the dream of unearthing a fortune. Yet as these 19th century miners began to stake their claims and swing their picks, they were met with a realization that was as humbling as it was mysterious. They were not the first to arrive at these veins of red metal. In fact, they were merely the latest visitors to a vast, ancient workshop that stretched for hundreds of miles. As the modern miners cleared away the overgrowth and began to excavate the earth, they found that the most accessible copper was already gone. They discovered thousands of narrow, deep trenches and pits, some stretching 20 or 30 feet into the solid rock, following the richest veins of ore with a precision that seemed impossible for a people without iron tools. These were not random holes in the ground. They were the remnants of a massive coordinated industrial effort that had taken place thousands of years before the first European sail appeared on the horizon. The modern miners found that in many cases their best strategy was simply to locate an ancient pit, clear out the leaf litter and the debris of centuries, and continue digging where the prehistoric miners had left off. It was as if they were following a map laid out in the earth itself, a blueprint of labor left behind by a civilization whose name had been lost to time. The scale of these findings began to attract the attention of the scientific community, leading to some of the earliest archaeological reports in the history of the United States. In the mid-19th century, surveyors like Josiah Whitney and Charles Whittlesey began to document these anomalies with a sense of growing wonder. They recorded the presence of thousands of hammerstones, rounded cobbles of hard volcanic rock, often grooved so they could be lashed to wooden handles, lying in heaps around the ancient pits. Some of these stones weighed over 30 pounds, and they were found in such staggering quantities that they were often used by 19th century settlers to pave roads or build the foundations of their homes. In 1848, a man named Samuel Knapp, an agent for the Minnesota Mining Company, made a discovery that would become a cornerstone of the copper culture mystery. While exploring a cavernous pit on the Keweenaw Peninsula, he cleared away a mass of debris and discovered a massive vein of copper that had been partially detached from the surrounding rock. Propped up on a system of charred oak timbers was a 6-ton mass of pure metal. The ancient miners had evidently been in the process of raising it to the surface when, for reasons we can only guess, they abandoned the project. The oak timbers, though ancient and soft with age, still bore the marks of the tools that had shaped them. This was not the work of casual scavengers. This was the evidence of a sophisticated engineering feat involving levers, fire setting to crack the rock, and a deep understanding of the properties of the earth. The Smithsonian Institution, still in its infancy, began to receive reports of these ancient diggings from across the Lake Superior region. The early researchers were struck by the sheer volume of material that had been removed. They calculated that if thousands of these pits existed, each yielding a certain amount of copper, the total weight of the metal extracted must have been astronomical. This was the birth of the 500,000-ton estimate, a figure that continues to ignite debate among historians and archaeologists to this day. Where did all that copper go? While some was certainly used for local tools and ornaments, the math simply didn't add up for a purely local population. This realization cast a long, lingering shadow over the burgeoning field of American archaeology, a feeling that the history of the continent was far deeper and more complex than anyone had dared to imagine. As the years passed and the modern copper rush reached its peak, the landscape was transformed. The ancient pits were often swallowed up by the massive shafts of industrial mining, their traces erased by the very progress they had facilitated. Yet the early surveyors had seen enough to know that they were walking in the footsteps of giants. They wrote of mound builders and lost races struggling to fit these finds into their limited understanding of human history. They saw the evidence of a people who possessed a mastery of the land that seemed at odds with the primitive labels of the era. These ancient miners had understood the geology of the region with a clarity that modern science was only beginning to replicate. They knew where the copper ran deep and where it broke the surface, and they had pursued it with a quiet, relentless focus that spanned generations. The realization that modern mining was essentially a process of scavenging, the leftovers of an ancient empire, was a bitter pill for some to swallow, yet for others it added a layer of profound mystery to the rugged beauty of the Northwoods. Every time a new vein was struck, there was the chance of finding a discarded copper knife or a broken hammerstone, a silent greeting from a predecessor who had stood in that same dark tunnel 5,000 years prior. The air in those early mines must have felt heavy with the weight of that continuity, a sense that time is not a straight line, but a series of overlapping circles, where the labours of one age become the foundations of the next. We are left to wonder about the conversations that took place in those 19th century camps as men sat by the fire and handled the heavy, green patinized tools they had pulled from the muck. Did they feel a kinship with the ones who came before? Or did they see them as ghosts haunting the veins of the earth? The Smithsonian reports of the era are filled with a clinical yet palpable awe. They describe the perfect state of preservation of some of the wooden implements found in the deep, cold water of the pits, shovels and bowls that looked as if they had been dropped only yesterday, preserved by the unique chemistry of the copper and the frigid temperatures of the northern ground. These artifacts were tangible links across the abyss of time, bridges between the era of steam and the era of stone. As the 19th century drew to a close, the mystery of the copper culture was firmly established in the American consciousness. It was no longer a matter of folklore or legend, but a documented reality of the landscape. The earth had been opened, and it had revealed a secret that defied easy explanation. The copper rush had brought the world to Lake Superior, but in doing so, it had also brought the world face to face with a forgotten chapter of its own story. The red metal was more than just a commodity. It was a thread, winding back through the millennia, connecting the industrial present to a distant, industrious past that still whispers from the depths of the ancient pits. If you were to stand on the northernmost reaches of the Keweenaw Peninsula and look out across the cold, slate-grey expanse of Lake Superior, you might catch a glimpse of a low shadow on the horizon, a jagged silhouette of rock and pine rising from the mist like the spine of a sleeping leviathan. This is Isle Royale. It is a place of profound silence, a wilderness disconnected from the frantic pulse of the modern world, where the only sounds are the rhythmic lap of the water against basalt cliffs and the mournful call of a loon echoing through the fog. Because of its isolation, the island has become a sort of vault, a sanctuary where the fingerprints of a lost age remain remarkably preserved, untouched by the ploughs and bulldozers that erased so much history on the mainland. To understand the scale of what happened here thousands of years ago, one must travel to Macargo Cove. It is a long, narrow inlet that carves deep into the island's interior, a natural harbour that seems almost designed for the landing of heavy vessels. Along the ridges flanking this water, the ground is not level, nor is it natural. It is pockmarked with thousands of depressions, ancient pits that stretch on for miles, partially filled with the leaf litter of 10,000 autumns and carpeted in deep emerald moss. When archaeologists first began to survey this area, they were struck not just by the number of excavations, but by the staggering density of the tools left behind. Scattered throughout these pits are the hammerstones, rounded cobbles of hard volcanic rock, worn smooth by the grip of hands that have long since returned to the earth. In some locations, these stones are found in such immense quantities that they form literal pavements beneath the forest floor. Thousands upon thousands of them, many showing the telltale fractures and chips of heavy use, lie exactly where they were dropped when the last miner walked away. It is estimated that millions of these stones were used across the island, each one carefully selected from distant beaches and carried miles inland to strike the stubborn rock. The sheer physical effort represented by these discarded tools is difficult for the modern mind to grasp, a labour of such intensity and duration that it suggests a devotion to the red metal that bordered on the sacred. The logistical challenges of mining on Isle Royale in the deep past are nothing short of overwhelming. Even today, the island is accessible only by boat or seaplane, and it remains closed for half the year as the Great Lakes winter descends with a crushing icy weight. The ancient miners did not have the luxury of modern navigation or steel-hulled ships. They arrived in craft of wood or bark, navigating one of the most treacherous bodies of water on the planet, all to reach a remote wilderness where the growing season is short and the soil is thin. They had to transport not only themselves, but also the supplies necessary to sustain a massive workforce in a place where survival is never guaranteed. As you walk among the pits today, the air feels heavy with the weight of these forgotten centuries. The forest has reclaimed the land, but it has not hidden the scars. You can see where the fire setting took place, a technique where the miners would build massive bonfires atop the copper-bearing veins until the rock glowed with heat, then suddenly douse the stone with cold lake water. The thermal shock would cause the basalt to shatter with a sound like a crack of thunder, exposing the veins of pure native copper hidden within. This was a slow, methodical process, requiring vast amounts of timber and a constant supply of water, all managed by people working in the shadow of a vast, unforgiving lake. There is a strange, haunting quality to these workings, a sense that the miners might return at any moment to reclaim their tools. In the stillness of the island, the boundary between the past and the present seems to thin. You find yourself wondering about the lives of those who laboured here during the archaic period, a time when, according to conventional chronologies, the rest of the world was only just beginning to experiment with the most basic forms of metallurgy. Yet here, on an island in the middle of a freshwater sea, a sophisticated and large-scale mining operation was already in full swing. The sheer volume of material removed from Isle Royale is what truly haunts the imagination. Some estimates suggest that the amount of rock excavated from these pits reaches into the hundreds of thousands of tons. When you consider that this was accomplished without iron tools, without explosives, and without the wheel, the mystery deepens into something sublime. Every pound of copper was won through the patient application of fire, water, and stone. Every ounce of metal was then carried down to the shores of Macargo Cove, loaded into waiting boats, and transported across the open water to the mainland. From there it vanished into the vastness of the continent, or perhaps, as some whisper, across the oceans to lands we have yet to identify. The island offers no easy answers, only more questions that drift like the morning mist through the cedar swamps. Who coordinated such an effort? How did they feed and house the hundreds, perhaps thousands, of workers required to maintain such an output? And why, after centuries of intense activity, did they simply stop? The pits remain, slowly filling with silt and shadows, while the copper they once held has been scattered to the corners of the earth, its origins forgotten by all but the stones themselves. As the sun begins to dip lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the moss-covered mounds of debris, the isolation of Isle Royale feels absolute. It is a place where time seems to have slowed to the pace of the growing lichen. The modern visitor is merely a ghost, passing through a landscape shaped by more substantial phantoms, the men and women of the copper culture who saw in this remote island a treasure worth any hardship. They left behind a monument not of gold or marble, but of broken stone and discarded hammers, a testament to a human drive that flourished in the deep silence of the North Woods long before the first lines of recorded history were ever written. The silence of the North Woods is not as empty as it seems, for the very air we breathe carries the chemical signature of those who laboured here thousands of years ago. To understand the true scale of the copper culture, we must look beyond the physical pits and hammerstones, turning instead to the invisible traces left behind in the Earth's own memory. Modern science has begun to peel back the layers of this mystery, using tools that would have seemed like sorcery to the early antiquarians. Through the use of mass spectrometry, a process that allows us to weigh atoms and identify their unique origins, researchers are now able to create a digital fingerprint for the copper found across the Americas. Every deposit of metal in the world has a specific isotopic signature, a delicate balance of lead and other trace elements that acts like a geological birth certificate. For decades, a cloud of speculation has hung over these islands, with some suggesting that the sheer volume of copper removed, estimated by some to be as much as 500,000 tons, could only be explained by a vast transatlantic trade network involving the civilizations of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. It is a compelling thought, imagining ships from distant shores navigating the cold swells of Lake Superior to fill their hulls with the purest metal on Earth. However, as the light of isotopic testing is cast upon these artifacts, the results tell a story that is perhaps even more remarkable for its isolation. Recent studies have shown that the vast majority of copper artifacts found in the mounds of the Mississippi Valley and the forests of the Great Lakes match the unique signature of the Keweenaw Peninsula perfectly. The metal stayed within the continent, moving through an ancient and sophisticated web of indigenous trade that spanned thousands of miles. Yet the absence of Old World signatures does not diminish the mystery. Rather, it deepens it. If this staggering amount of metal was mined solely for internal use, it suggests a population and a level of social organization far more complex than history books once dared to imagine. While the metal itself tells us where it went, the very mud at the bottom of remote lakes tells us when the work began. Scientists have recently begun extracting long vertical cores of sediment from the beds of lakes near the mining sites. These cores are like the rings of a tree, each millimeter representing a year of fallen dust and settled silt. Within these dark, cold layers, researchers have discovered a spike in atmospheric lead pollution that dates back over 6,000 years. This was not the result of modern industry, but the byproduct of ancient smelting and thermal mining, the process of using intense fire and cold water to shatter the stubborn rock. As the miners kindled their great fires, the smoke carried microscopic particles of lead into the sky, where they drifted and eventually settled into the quiet waters of the surrounding lakes. This chemical record reveals a continuous period of industrial activity that lasted for millennia, ebbing and flowing with the changing climate and the rise and fall of ancient traditions. It confirms that the copper culture was not a brief flash of activity, but a sustained, multi-generational effort that fundamentally altered the chemistry of the local environment long before the first pyramids were raised in Egypt. We are also beginning to see the faces of these miners through the emerging field of paleogenomics, DNA preserved in the cool, acidic soil of the north, and even more surprisingly, within the hardened dental calculus, the ancient plaque, on the teeth of those buried in nearby mounds, is providing a new window into their lives. By examining this biological record, scientists can determine not only the ancestry of the miners, but also what they ate and what illnesses they carried. The dental calculus acts as a microscopic time capsule, trapping fragments of plant fibers, pollen, and even the proteins from the fish and game that sustained them through the long, brutal winters. This evidence suggests a people who were deeply integrated into their environment, moving with the seasons and maintaining a diet that was rich and varied. They were not a desperate or struggling people, but a healthy and robust population that had mastered the art of survival in a landscape that remains challenging even today. The DNA profiles are helping to bridge the gap between the ancient copper culture and the modern indigenous nations of the Great Lakes, showing a long-standing continuity of presence that stretches back into the mists of the post-glacial era. And so, the image of the lone, primitive miner is being replaced by a vision of a sophisticated society, one that understood the properties of the earth and the movements of the stars. As we look at these lead signatures and genetic markers, we are forced to confront the limits of our own knowledge. We see the footprints of a civilization that operated on a scale we are only just beginning to quantify, using a technology that was perfectly adapted to its time and place. The copper was not just a commodity, it was a sacred substance, a piece of the earth's own bones, extracted with a reverence and a persistence that lasted for 60 centuries. The mystery of where those 500,000 tons of copper vanished to remains a subject of quiet debate. While much of it is accounted for in the thousands of spear points, knives, and ornaments found across the continent, some believe that a vast portion of the treasure remains hidden, perhaps buried in caches that have yet to be rediscovered or lost to the slow, grinding erosion of time. As the mist rolls over the copper-laden ridges of Isle Royale, we are reminded that for all our modern instruments and chemical fingerprints, the deep past keeps its most profound secrets well guarded. We are merely scratching the surface of a story that is written in the very stones beneath our feet and the atoms in the air we breathe. A story of a people who saw the value in the red metal and spent 6,000 years proving its worth to the world. Consider for a moment the weight of a single copper nugget, cold and heavy in the palm of a hand, and then multiply that weight by 1 billion. The sheer scale of the missing metal is a figure that haunts the quiet halls of North American archaeology, a mathematical ghost that refuses to be laid to rest. If 500,000 tons of copper were indeed pulled from the earth, the landscape should be practically paved with it. We are forced to look at the continent with new eyes, searching for where such a vast treasure might have gone if it did not all cross the salt-colored waves of the Atlantic. Perhaps the answer is not found in distant ports, but remains hidden right beneath the soil of the Midwest, tucked away in the thousands of earthen mounds that rise like green waves from the forest floor. These mounds, often dismissed as simple burial sites or territorial markers, may in fact be the greatest repositories of ancient wealth ever constructed. As we walk through the quiet, shaded valleys of the Ohio River or the rolling plains of Wisconsin, we are walking over a subterranean library of metal. Archaeologists have long known that the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures placed immense value on copper, but our excavations have only touched a fraction of these sites. It is entirely possible that the missing 500,000 tons are not missing at all, but are simply waiting in undiscovered caches buried deep within the stratigraphy, the layered history of the earth, where the soil has reclaimed what was once borrowed. We must consider the possibility that the ancient people of the copper culture were not just miners, but curators of a continental treasury. They may have viewed the red metal as a sacred substance that belonged to the earth herself, returning it to the ground in elaborate ceremonies that we are only beginning to imagine. The math of the missing copper begins to balance when we acknowledge the staggering number of mounds that once dotted the landscape. Before the plough and the bulldozer smoothed the earth for modern cities, there were tens of thousands of these structures, ranging from small rises to massive platformed hills like Cahokia. If even a small percentage of these mounds contained copper offerings, the cumulative weight would be monumental. This perspective shifts our understanding of these ancient people from simple nomads to masters of a complex continental economy. They were engineers who understood the flow of resources across thousands of miles, creating a network of trade and ritual that functioned with the precision of a clock. The copper was the lifeblood of this system, flowing from the northern pits of Isle Royale down the great arterial waterways of the Mississippi and the Missouri, eventually finding its rest in the dark, quiet earth of a ceremonial mound. There is a profound sophistication in this ancient North American engineering that often goes unrecognized in our standard histories. To move such quantities of ore required more than just physical strength. It required a deep understanding of logistics, seasonal navigation, and social organization. We see the evidence of this in the way the pits were dug, following the veins of copper with a surgical precision that avoided unnecessary labor. They used fire and water to crack the stone, a technique of thermal expansion that required a patient mastery of the elements. When we look at the remnants of these mines, we are not looking at the work of primitive hands, but at the fingerprints of a global technological pioneer. Long before the Bronze Age flourished in the Mediterranean, the people of the Great Lakes were experimenting with the properties of metal, discovering how to harden it through cold hammering and how to shape it into tools that could survive for millennia. As the centuries stretched into millennia, this knowledge was passed down through 1,000 generations, whispered around fires, and demonstrated in the flickering light of a summer evening. The copper culture represents a peak of human ingenuity that existed in a time we often think of as empty or silent. But the silence is only in our own ears. The past was loud with the sound of stone hammers hitting copper, the splashing of heavy canoes in the shallows, and the rhythmic chanting of workers as they hauled the red stone from the deep. They were a people who looked at a raw, green-stained rock and saw the potential for beauty and utility. They were the first to truly harness the mineral wealth of the New World, and in doing so, they set the stage for everything that was to follow. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not where the copper went, but why we struggle so much to accept the scale of what was achieved. We are often trapped by the idea that history moves in a straight line from simple to complex, yet the copper culture suggests a different path, one where great heights were reached and then quietly faded into the background of the forest. The sheer volume of the work on Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula serves as a silent rebuke to our limited timelines. It asks us to consider a North America that was bustling with industry and innovation while the pyramids were still being dreamed of in the sands of Egypt. It invites us to imagine a world where the primary currency was not gold or silver, but a glowing, sun-colored metal that was traded from the sub-Arctic forests to the tropical shores of the Gulf. In the quiet moments of the night, when the wind stirs the leaves of the northern pines, it is easy to feel the presence of these ancient miners. They are there in the strange depressions of the earth and the unnatural shapes of the hills. They are there in the very chemistry of the lake water, which still carries the faint echoes of their industry. We are only now beginning to develop the tools, through radiocarbon dating and advanced soil analysis, to see the true outlines of their world. Radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon isotopes to tell us the age of organic material, has pushed the dates of these mines further and further back into the misty reaches of the Middle Holocene. Each new discovery is a thread in a tapestry that is far larger and more intricate than we ever suspected. And so, we are left with a sense of wonder at the persistence of human spirit. The copper culture was not a brief flash in the pan of history. It was a steady, enduring flame that burned for 6,000 years. They navigated the largest freshwater lakes on the planet in bark vessels, carrying loads that would challenge a modern boat. They lived in harmony with a landscape that was often harsh and unforgiving, yet they found the time and the will to create objects of exquisite beauty. As we contemplate the 500,000 tons of metal that moved through their hands, we must realize that the true treasure is not the copper itself, but the story of the people who mined it. They remind us that the history of the Americas is deep, complex, and filled with a brilliance that the shadows of time can never fully obscure. Meanwhile, the earth continues to guard its secrets with a patient, stony silence. The copper that remains in the ground and the copper that lies hidden in the mounds stays cool and dark, untouched by the sun for thousands of years. It is a reminder that our own time is but a brief moment in the vast span of geological and human history. The copper culture mystery invites us to be humble, to recognize that there are chapters of our story that have been lost to the wind and the rain, and that much of what we think we know is merely a whisper of the truth. As we look toward the horizon, where the blue of the lake meets the blue of the sky, we can almost see the ghosts of the copper seekers, their paddles dipping into the water, heading north toward the red veins of the earth, guided by the stars and the ancient knowledge of those who came before. The importance of viewing the copper culture as a global pioneer cannot be overstated. They were not an isolated phenomenon, but a vital part of the human journey, exploring the possibilities of the physical world with the same curiosity and drive that leads us to explore the stars today. Their legacy is written in the landscape, a monumental testament to a time when the world was young and the red metal was the key to the future. As the mist settles over the old pits of Isle Royale, we are left to marvel at the scale of their ambition and the quiet dignity of their disappearance, leaving behind only the stones, the mounds, and the enduring riddle of the missing copper. The scent of cedar and damp stone hangs heavy in the air as the long shadows of the northern pines stretch across the abandoned diggings, reaching toward the water's edge like the fingers of a giant. It is a quiet that feels ancient, a silence that has been settling over the Keweenaw Peninsula for thousands of years, layering itself over the landscape like the very sediment that filled the pits long ago. Underneath the moss and the fallen leaves, the copper remains. Some of it is still tucked away in deep, narrow veins, while other fragments lie scattered in the glacial till, small nuggets turned green by the slow, patient chemistry of the earth. This metal is more than just a resource. It is a lingering vibration of a forgotten era, a physical memory of a time when the world was larger, stranger, and far more connected than we often care to admit. As we stand upon these shores, we are forced to confront the sheer scale of the labor that once took place here. To move 500,000 tons of rock and ore is not merely a feat of engineering. It is a testament to a collective will that spans generations. One can almost hear the rhythmic thud of stone mauls against the basalt, a steady, hypnotic pulse that once echoed from Isle Royale to the Ontonagon River. It was a symphony of industry that played out over 3 millennia, yet the musicians have vanished, leaving behind only their instruments and the scars they carved into the bones of the earth. We look for their names in the soil, but the soil only offers us the tools. We look for their cities, but we find only the temporary camps of people who seem to treat the land with a nomadic reverence, taking what they needed and then receding back into the vastness of the continental interior. The mystery of the missing copper is a riddle that refuses to be solved by simple logic alone. If the metal did not stay here, where did it go? We imagine the great canoes laden with heavy ingots, gliding silently through the morning mist of Lake Superior, heading toward the southern rivers or perhaps toward the distant salt spray of the Atlantic. We imagine the copper being hammered into delicate breastplates for the Hopewell elites, or perhaps being traded hand to hand across thousands of miles until it reached the workshops of civilizations whose names have been scrubbed from the historical record. The copper was a bridge between worlds, a red thread that tied the cold northern forests to the warm deltas of the south and perhaps even further. It reminds us that humanity has always been a restless species, driven by a desire for beauty and utility that transcends the boundaries of geography. In the grand tally of deep time, our own modern civilization is but a fleeting moment, a thin layer of plastic and steel resting atop the vast stratigraphy of the past. Stratigraphy, the study of the layers of the earth, tells us that everything eventually sinks. The grandest monuments of the copper culture were not made of stone or brick, but of the very earth itself, and so they have returned to the earth. The pits have filled with rainwater and leaves. The mounds have been softened by the wind until they resemble natural hills. The copper tools have oxidized into the soil, returning their atoms to the ground from which they were first pried. There is a profound humility in this cycle, a reminder that all our achievements are ultimately on loan from the planet. The people of the old copper complex understood this, perhaps better than we do. They worked with the grain of the world, following the veins of metal where they led, and when the copper became too difficult to reach or the climate shifted during the long cooling of the centuries, they simply moved on. The water of Lake Superior is so clear and cold that it seems to hold time in a state of suspension. Far beneath the surface, where the light of the sun fails to reach, there are likely artifacts that have remained untouched for 5,000 years, preserved in the near-freezing depths where decay is slowed to a crawl. Perhaps the answers we seek are down there, resting in the silt of the lake bed, waiting for a future generation to find them. But for now, we are left with the questions. We are left to wonder about the sailors who navigated these treacherous inland seas without the aid of modern charts, and the miners who spent their lives in the dark, damp earth, guided only by the flicker of a grease lamp and the hope of finding a shimmering vein of red. As the twilight deepens, the lake begins to take on a metallic sheen, reflecting the bruised purples and deep oranges of the fading sky. The water laps gently against the shore, a soft, repetitive sound that has not changed since the first human set foot on these rocks. It is a sound that dissolves the centuries, making the distance between the ancient miner and the modern observer feel impossibly thin. In this light, it is easy to imagine that the past is not truly gone, but merely hidden behind a veil of shadow. The missing copper is still out there, in one form or another. Perhaps it is sitting in a museum case halfway across the world, or perhaps it has been melted down and repurposed so many times that it now resides in the wiring of our own homes, a silent passenger from the Bronze Age powering the lights of the 21st century. The mystery remains, and perhaps it should. There is a certain beauty in the unknown, a dignity in a story that refuses to be neatly summarized. The copper culture represents a chapter of human history that is written in a language we are only just beginning to decipher, a language of stone, fire, and metal. It teaches us that the world is far older and more complex than our history books often suggest, and that beneath the surface of our everyday lives there are layers of experience and effort that we may never fully comprehend. As we look out over the darkened waters, we can feel the weight of those forgotten ages, a heavy, comforting blanket of time that reminds us of our place in the long, unfolding story of the earth. The stars begin to appear now, mirrored in the still surface of the lake, each one a distant fire in the cold void. They are the same stars that guided the copper seekers home, the same constellations that watched over the building of the mounds and the digging of the pits. The world turns, the seasons change, and civilizations rise and fall like the tides, but the land remains, the copper remains. And as the night air cools and the forest settles into its deep nocturnal rhythm, we find a sense of peace in the enduring mystery of the silent shore. The work is finished, the tools are put away, and the red metal sleeps once more in the heart of the stone. We are merely visitors here, passing through a landscape that remembers everything, even if we have forgotten. The mist rolls in from the water, blurring the line between the lake and the sky until everything is a soft, seamless grey, a world of shadows and echoes, where the past and the present meet in the quiet of the northern night. Under the weight of the years, under the cover of the moss, the earth keeps its secrets well, and we, in our turn, find rest in the knowledge that some stories are too vast to ever truly end.